Pete had several lawsuits against Epstein, the Beatles, and Playboy magazine. All were very quietly settled in his favor.
First time I met George, he was playing in a third-rate group in a club called Lowlands, which was in the same street, about 100 yards down the road. And I liked the sound of the group. At that time, my mother was opening a club which she was going to call the Casbah. And I said it'd be a good idea if that group played at the club on the opening night.
May I ask you, what was the name of that group?
At the moment, I don't know. But, they didn't have a very big name or anything like that.
At this time, was George with two separate people, or was he with the two people known as the Beatles now?
No, it was a separate group.
Oh, it was a separate group, so It wasn't the Beatles at the time. In other words, George Harrison, what year was this?
That'd be about 1959.
1959, George Harrison was playing near your home with two other kids, and what do they have, basically 3 guitars?
Yeah, the usual lineup.
In the small club, what were they earning?
Oh, chicken feed, but the most £1 a night, something like that.
Right.
£1 a night.
$2.80.
And as I understand it, your mother was about to open a nightclub.
That's
now, where was this nightclub supposed to be?
Well, it was in the basement of our house. We've got a big house, and
19 rooms.
She wanted to open it up in the basement. That time, I wasn't playing the drums at all. All I knew was George, from playing in this group. So anyway, the day that the club was going to open, this group he was playing with split up, over some matter or something like that. So I asked him, I said, what's going to happen, George? There's no group for tonight, and we've booked you in and we've billed and everything like that. So he said, there's only one thing I know. There's another boy in the group I was playing for, a chap called Ken Brown. He's willing to join me. And there's also 2 boys who I used to play in a skiffle group with, called the Quarrymen, and they were John Lennon and Paul McCartney. So that same evening they got together. They had about 2 hours practice, something like that. And it was stuck for a name, so someone suggested the Quarrymen. So they went along with that idea. And, the Quarrymen was born again. And for about 3 to 4 months they played in the club every weekend.
Okay, now we have a group called the Quarrymen working at the Casbah, which is owned by your mother, Mona Best.
Well, we used to seat about 400. But
400?
But at the weekends we used to get in about 900, something like that.
Okay, now how did it go from the Quarrymen to what we know as the Beatles?
Well, they played in the club for about 4 months, resident every weekend.
What were they earning?
About 15 shillings a night.
That's $2.
$2 for the entire band, or was
No,
it
15 shillings, a man. Altogether, it was about £3, for the whole group.
for the whole? In other words, they earned the equivalent of about $2 per man per night.
That's it. Then they left the Casbah. They wanted work elsewhere. They thought they were getting a bit stale in the club. So, at that time, there was a big impresario in England called Larry Parnes, and he needed a group to back a singer of his called Johnny Gentle. And he decided on this group. Anyway, prior to their tour in Scotland with Johnny Gentle, they came up with the name of the Silver Beatles, and they played with that name for must have been about 6 months. When they left the club, the Casbah, Ken Brown, who'd been playing guitarist with them, didn't go. He said, I quit, more or less. And at that time, there was a friend of John's from art school, a chap called Stu Sutcliffe, and he was playing bass for them. He joined the group, and he played bass. And at the time he more or less started playing bass for them, they took on the name the Silver Beatles. And after that, they were engaged to do this tour of Scotland for Johnny Gentle. And they were on that tour about 2 to 3 weeks. Anyway, they came back from the tour, and Paul phoned me up and said, we've had an...
Paul McCartney, then.
Paul McCartney, yeah. He phoned me up and he said, we've had an offer from Alan Williams, who owned a club in Liverpool called the Jacaranda, to go to Hamburg, Germany, and play in the Indra Club and the Kaiserkeller. So...
That's on the Reeperbahn.
Yeah, that's on the Reeperbahn. So I went down, I said, yeah, it sounds fine to me. So he said, well, you'll have to audition first. So I said, that's fine. So we went to some ramshackle old club called the Wyvern, where they used to practice at that time. And I auditioned with them for about 2 hours. And Alan Williams was there, and he said, yeah, it's fine. Everything's
They
okay.
liked your tempo and your beat and your so forth. What I'd like to know is, how did they get the name Beatles?
I decided more than anything else that we should, drop the silver altogether and just keep it as the Beatles. You know,
Then actually, you are responsible for the name Beatles. Is this so?
in a way, yeah.
Why did you decide to drop the silver on Beatles? Must be a story to that.
Well, it was a group suggestion more than anything else. You know, but I sponsored it.
What was wrong with silver?
And
why silver?
well, at that time when they'd been touring in Scotland, they wore black shirts and black pants, and they had silver edgings on the shirt. So it was a bit corny.
Now, who was the leader of the group?
Well, I was the leader in a way because I used to do a lot of the business.
In other words, you are their business manager.
Yeah, I took over all the business details and signing of contracts and promoting the bookings and everything.
So actually, you are responsible for what happened to this world in the way of the Beatles. You came up with the name Beatles.
Yeah.
You sponsored them originally in the form of contracts. You came upon all of these different people who had various nightclubs in different parts of London, England, and Germany, and you yourself came up with all of this.
Please note that these facts were fully supported in the Beatle lawsuit and proved by contracts that Pete possessed.
Well, tell me, Peter, what happened after that? Now we come back from Hamburg. We're in England. This is 1961, if I'm not mistaken, August 1961.
No, well, actually, we got back December 1960, you know, just before Christmas.
Very good.
We were in Hamburg about 4.5 months.
What happened in Germany? Where did you live in Germany? What type of a house?
Well, the first 2 months that we were in Germany, the first time, we played at a club called the Indre, which wasn't actually on the Reeperbahn, it was off the Reeperbahn. It was in a street called the Grosse Freiheit. And the manager of this club was a chap called Bruno Koschmiede, and he also owned a cinema. So at that time we were wild and reckless, and we didn't really care where we slept. So the accommodation he gave us was 2 rooms in the back of his cinema. And one room was like the Black Hole at Calcutta.
Who were you bunking with at the time, and how were they split up?
Well, I was in the Black Hole at Calcutta with Paul McCartney, and about 100 yards down the alleyway there was another room which wasn't quite as bad as the Black Hole. And there was John Lennon, George Harrison, and Stu Sutcliffe in there.
And Stu Sutcliffe. So it was actually basically 5 of you.
Yeah.
That were working.
At that time, you know, in Germany, most of the clubs are drinking clubs. The first time we were there, you know, there wasn't too much action. You know, we were mostly fighting with drunks or something like that. There was a memorable fight when, in the middle of a number, Tony Sheridan offered me out.
He wanted to fight you?
On stage, so of course the numbers stopped and I put the drumsticks down and both of us walked out into the alleyway and beat hell out of one another.
But what about the Beatles as we know them, John, Paul, and George? Did you ever get any arguments with them?
Not into any arguments where there was violence or anything like that. You know, there were the usual group arguments.
But you never got into a fight with them?
No. There was, we used to have what we call our sparring round sessions, but it was just everyone would just have a rough house or something like that. But it was all good-hearted fun.
Your arguments with them, what were they about?
Oh, you know, various things about dress on stage and tempos and numbers. You know, the usual.
Was any of it about girls?
Yeah, we had, you know, a number of times we'd argue about who was going to take on the best-looking girl or something like that.
Who wound up with the best-looking girl?
Me.
You?
Yeah.
Was this because you were able to handle yourself, or why was it? I mean, you're a good-looking fella, I must admit that.
Well, let's see now. In Germany, I seemed to be very popular.
With the girls?
With the girls, of course. And if there was any dating or anything to be done, it'd be me. I'd be the one they'd aim for, that type of deal.
How did you spend your time outside the club when you were basically through working? What'd you do?
Well, by the time we'd finished working, in those days we used to work 8 hours a night. We'd start at 6 and finish at 2 in the morning during the week.
What'd you do before? In other words, your basic time for enjoying yourself was before, and maybe a little after, but most of the time before. What did you do before you went into the club?
Well, by the time we'd woken up, it was about 3 o'clock in the afternoon.
Oh, great. In other words, you had, all sorts of time. You had 2 hours to do what?
Yeah, well...
You walk around and you see the rest of Hamburg?
Yeah, well, the first time we were there, we were like, as well as being musicians, we were tourists.
How did people take you when you walked around? You walk around in black leather jackets?
After about a month, we walked around in black leather jackets.
People stare at you all the time?
Oh, yeah, all the time.
And they make remarks in German about how nutty you were or anything?
Well, one thing that was very prominent at that time was that we had what we call winkle picker boots.
Winkle picker boots.
Winkle picker boots,
Very
yeah.
good.
And we had those specially made for us before we left for
What
Germany.
did they look like?
They were made out of great crocodile skin,
So you were
with a strap across, a great big long point, and a Cuban heel.
Can you fill me in on some more details as to exactly what was going on during that time?
Well, there was one particular incident when we were eating, and it was about 4 o'clock in the morning. We were all dead beat. And we were having a laughing joke over our meal. And all of a sudden, George threw a tomato onto John's plate. So John picked the tomato up and he threw it back onto George's plate. So George gets 2 tomatoes and throws it back onto John's plate. So the next thing that happens is John picks up his plate with the steak and everything on and empties it over George's head.
Wow.
So, that was the mad things we used to do. Another time, George and myself bet John that he wouldn't go out into the street, in his underwear. At that time, he'd bought a big, long pair of, underpants. John was fully dressed, so he says, right, you're on. So he goes out, gets on the street, and he's got a string vest on, a baseball cap, pair of carpet slippers, and these white long johns. He's wearing a pair of sunglasses, and he stands in the middle of the Grocer Freiheit, reading a newspaper while the people's walking up and down.
That's a good story.
So he won the bet.
Yeah, he won the bet. But,
What was the wager for it?
well, I think it was, 5 marks each or something like that.
5 marks each.